Hello and welcome to my studio on a very rainy day. Today I want to talk to you about shadows and the order of printing. So I'm using a lino cut that I'm working on at the moment. This is Duncansby Head up in the north of Scotland, and I am just engaged in trying to create three-dimensional rocks on this hillside. And I have so far been inking up with a mixture of coloured ink, little bit of extender, but mostly white and a grey and a rosy pink. And I've started, you can probably see, to cut in and create these rocks. Also on these slopes, there is grass. And that is a bit of a dilemma because the grass needs to be a different colour from the rocks, and there's always this question about when should you put it in. And if I am working with rocks like this, I always leave the grass layer until I've got all of the rocks printed, even though that means going darker than I may want to do with the grass in tone, because the minute I put green grass, or whatever colour grass I decide to use, on here, it's going to change the inks over the rocks as well. So what I do instead is I do my rocks in opaque layers, maybe one layer, maybe two layers as here. Then I switch to transparent shadows, transparent ink, to lay down more shadows. And this keeps the colour tones right for the rocks, and it means that I'm building up the tonal values. In this particular picture, the sun's coming in this sort of way, so you've got these pale areas here, this is much darker. Then when I come to do the grasses later on, and we'll probably make a film about that bit, I put my grasses on top of these dark tones and actually use them to show through the green of the grass to create shadows in the grass as well. So rather than worry about the grass at this stage, I forget it until the rocks are completed. So now I'm going to use the transparent inking. So if we go over to my inking table here, I've got some really horrible colours mixed up. And actually they look terrible, real sort of tobacco colours. They're actually neutral greys of different tones. So I did, to show you what they really look like, I've mixed up a little bit of the grey that I'm using with some white pigment, and I've created this little mix of grey, and that is the true colour. What's happening with these very extended inks is that there's a reaction where transient chromophores in the ink change in appearance and show as a yellow. Now, I have made a video about this, and I will link to it in the description below if you are interested in the science bit. So to go back to these rather horrible colours, ignore the tobacco, that will disappear. What I've got is I've got three tones here. So this one has maybe 5% pigmented ink to extender. This one maybe 8. This one maybe 20%. I mean, I'm rubbish with percent, so I'm guessing, but different tones. And before we go any further, can I just remind you, in case you haven't heard it too many times already, before you work with extender, it picks up dust like crazy, and as does ordinary ink, but it's much worse with extenders. So when you're going to mix out extenders like this, always dust the plate where you're mixing the inks, and make sure that your rollers are free of dust and your tools are free of dust, because that's going to make a big difference to how well the extender rolls out. And the other thing to remember with extender is you need to work the roller a lot to even out the extender when you're working with it. So I am going to use this first palest tone to begin with. So if we come over to the lino here. I've got my print all lined up and ready to go, and I am going to start inking up on this side of the hill and a little bit over on that side. This is the pale side. This is where the sun is hitting. So I need to make the most of this layer of ink on this area. So that's why I'm focusing on that, because I'm going to come in and I'm going to drop the darker tones into this area which isn't getting the sun. So my initial inking is all about getting the shadows into the areas where the sun is hitting, and I don't need it to be so dark. And then just spreading the extender out. So you can see I'm just working away to get the extender even. And I'm not using a great big roller because I want to make sure that I do have plenty of opportunity to work that extender. If I had a great big roller and I was working and working to even out the extender, what would happen is that I would be depositing loads of ink all round in the dead space, which wouldn't be great. So a smaller roller is still big enough to bridge this gap, and a little bit of fluff there, let's just take that off. It's still big enough to bridge this gap here, but it's not so big that it's depositing loads where I don't want it. So I'm just taking my time to get that evenly spread out. Okay. So before I go any further, I'm just going to have a wipe round, and I'm using an old bit of sheeting here because I don't want any stray hairs. Just making sure these areas, they probably wouldn't print even if I didn't wipe them, but I'm not taking the risk, because when you're working with white space like I work with a lot, you really, really don't want any marks in that white space, because it's immediately obvious if you get them in the wrong place. Okay, so first impression. And I'm just checking to see that everything is spot on. Yep, that's all lined up. And I am going to use a reasonably light pressure here. I'm going to use 2 pieces of card. I can use up to, I could probably manage with 5 layers of card at maximum pressure. So I'm going to use just 2 here because I don't want to put too much weight on. I've already got 1 sheet attached to my registration device here, so we're using 3 pieces. And you can see there's not a lot, I'm not hauling on this, it's quite a gentle pressure there. And when I lift that up, you can barely see any developments going on in here. The tone is just too pale to show anything happening. However, it is giving me nice detail here, and that's what I was after. So the next thing I'm going to do is to go for that mid-tone. And now I'm going to put a darker tone in this area where the shadow is. This area of the rock really is in deep shadow. I'm not going to ink it now, just at the moment. I'm going to use the even darker tone in there. A little bit more. And the other area that is particularly dark is around the back of this hill is not getting much light. So I'm just going to put a little bit of shadow there. Okay, lovely. And the reason that I'm doing this in 2 hits rather than putting pale on the pale and dark on the dark is because it's easier to get a more naturalistic blend if you put a coat of the pale over everything and get that nice and even, print it, and then put your shadows in and get them nice and even and print them. If you try and do it all at once, then you tend to get gloopy bits where you're not blending as much as you should be. So that's why I'm doing it in 2 hits. So the next job is to put some darker shadow in here. And here I'm being careful because I don't want the dark to go too high and too dark in this rock here. So I'm just being a little bit careful. And the other thing is that I've got rocks down here which are in the sun, and I do not want that darkest tone there. So a little bit of wiping to get rid of any excess. So you do have to kind of pay attention when you're doing this. So I'm just going to take out, and that's another good reason for not doing all the layers of tone at the same time, because of course now I can wipe away here and it's not going to affect the finished print. So just a little bit of wiping there, and I'm just going to dab that. I just want to not have too much ink in these places. I'm looking at the print to see what it needs. Okay, that's looking fine. And again, back down and a check. You know, always try and check your registration as you go along, because you may set it up and it be perfect and you nudge it or something and it's off. So I'm sort of in the habit of always checking that. Same pressure again. 2 pieces of card and the bit that's already in the machine. Good. Okay. So I'm happy with that and I'm going to show it to you properly. If I wasn't, I would go back in and add more tone and ink again. So I have been known to ink things 2 or 3 times. So now I've finished doing the layer of tone, you can see how that shadow is sort of popping out all these rocks and the detail here. And the contrast between the tones of shadow is giving me this subtlety on the pale area in contrast to these darker areas. So you can see also why it was important that I didn't have any of the dark shadow from this sort of rocky, I guess it's an island you could call it, little rocky bit here. I didn't want it on this bit that's in the sun on the cliff here. So that's why I was being careful about wiping that off. The other thing about it is that sometimes when you print with extender, it can, especially when you're printing details, you can end up with little tiny flecks of extender in the detail. It's not that it's flooded it, it's just catching a little bit. If that happens, then, see if I can find some, a little blot with some newsprint yes, you can see it just takes off any excess there and just smooths things out if you've got a problem with that. So always a good idea to just check if you need to do that. So what will happen next is I'm going to take out some more rocky details, the last of the rocky detail, and I'll be dropping in an even darker shadow to finish things off. And then I will move over to the final bit of the print, which is the grassy area. So these big white spaces, there is nothing going to be printed in them. Now, the reason that I do that is because I want everybody to look at the stuff that's happening between the cliffs. And I quite like using white space as a way of creating impact and pulling you towards the centre of the picture. Inevitably, some people will just see it as snow, and that's kind of okay by me. If they want to think it's snow, that's fine. It isn't, but you know, everything's open to interpretation. So if you would like to see how I'm going to resolve the grass on this, do remember to subscribe to the channel. If you've liked the video, give me a thumbs up, because that really helps. And I will join you again back in the studio another time. Thank you for watching.